Eleanor Brennan was 27, driving alone through the Blue Ridge Mountains at 11 at night after a 14-hour nursing shift when her headlights swept across a figure stumbling along the roadside. Then she saw it, a man running into the forest, carrying a limping child in navy blue pajamas. For 3 days and 2 nights, Ellie tracked a kidnapper through the wilderness, stayed hidden in the freezing cold, kept that 7-year-old boy alive with smuggled food and whispered promises through the cabin floorboards, and built signal fires that finally brought the man whose name commanded silence in every corner of the city and his army of 50 men to that abandoned cabin. What drove her wasn't just her nursing instincts. It was a promise. I won't leave you. For Ellie, walking away was never an option. But before we continue, let this sink in. Ellie was just a nurse. She tracked a kidnapper through freezing days and nights. She gave away all her food, slept maybe 3 hours total. Stayed when running would have been safer and smarter. Why? Because she promised a terrified 7-year-old boy she wouldn't leave him. Ask yourself this. When was the last time you kept a promise that cost you everything? I promised him I wouldn't leave. A nurse's word is a bond written in blood. That's what Eleanor Brennan would say days later, standing in a hospital room when the most feared man in the criminal underworld knelt before her and asked why she risked her life for his son. But on that cold October night at 11:19, she didn't know whose child she was saving. She only knew what she saw, and what she saw wasn't right. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss what happens next. Share this story with someone who needs to believe in ordinary heroes, and if you've ever kept a promise when breaking it would have been easier, drop a comment below. Ellie slammed the brakes, her hands clamped around the steering wheel so hard her knuckles went white. She quickly steered the car off the asphalt, hiding it behind a thick cluster of pines on the shoulder before shifting into park. She switched off the headlights, and darkness crashed down like a black curtain. In that moment, all she could hear was the heavy thud of her own heartbeat and the quick, ragged sound of her breathing. What had she just seen? A man, an unconscious child. Navy blue pajamas, one sock missing, left behind on the road somewhere. Ellie stepped out of the car and the cold October air hit her face like a slap. She shivered, partly from the chill, partly from what she'd just witnessed. 14 hours. She had spent the entire day on her feet at the clinic. Her feet ached. Her eyes burned from lack of sleep. And at home, her mother was lying in a sick bed, waiting for Ellie to come back so she could change the bandages and give her medicine. Ellie should have driven on. She knew that. She pulled out her phone, hoping she could call 911. But the screen flashed the message she knew too well and hated on sight. No signal. That was the Blue Ridge for you. She'd grown up here. She knew it by heart. She'd have to drive at least 20 more minutes before she'd find reception. 20 minutes. Plus the time it would take to explain to the police. Plus the time it would take for them to believe an exhausted nurse telling them about what she saw in the woods at night. It could take hours. And in those hours, what would happen to that child? Ellie stared into the night forest where the man had disappeared. The darkness was thick as ink. Not a sound. Reasons told her to get back in the car, drive on, find a signal, call the police. That was the safe choice. That was the sensible choice. But the image of the child kept looping through her mind, an arm hanging limp, a head tipped back, a single white sock dropped somewhere along the road, and the way the man had carried him. Not like a father carrying his child, but like someone hauling away a prize. That wasn't how a father carried a child. Ellie knew that. She'd seen every kind of parent rushing a child into an emergency room, worried, panicked, gentle, careful, but never like that. Never running into the woods close to midnight with an unconscious child in his arms, Ellie opened the trunk and pulled out the nurse's bag she always kept with her. Inside was a small flashlight, the kind she used to check a patient's pupils, a few protein bars she'd meant to eat on the drive home but had been too tired to touch, a half-finished bottle of water, and an old Zippo lighter, a keepsake from when she still smoked 3 years ago. She looked at those things. Nothing to defend herself with, nothing to face a man who could be a dangerous criminal. But she did have something many people didn't. She knew these woods. Ellie had grown up in the Blue Ridge Mountains, and before her father walked out when she was 8, it bought her everything she needed to know to survive in the forest. How to read direction from the moss on a tree trunk, how to find a water source, which roots could be eaten, and most of all, how to move at night without making a sound. That was the only thing her father had left behind. Not love, not protection, just knowledge. Cold and practical, just like the man himself. Ellie had hated those lessons once. Hated being dragged out of bed at 5 in the morning to learn how to set a rabbit snare. Hated being left alone in the woods and forced to find her own way home. Hated everything that had anything to do with the man who'd abandoned her and her mother without a single explanation. But tonight, for the first time in her life, she was grateful for those lessons. Ellie clicked on the flashlight and switched it to red light mode. Red light didn't give away your position in the dark. Didn't destroy your night vision, a trick her father had taught her, a trick she'd never imagined she'd need. She looked into the night forest one more time, her heart hammered. Her hands trembled a little, but her feet had already moved. The first step, then the second, then the third. Ellie Brennan walked into the darkness, leaving safety behind. She didn't know what she was walking into. She didn't know who that man was. She didn't know if the child was still alive. She only knew one thing. She couldn't drive away, couldn't pretend she hadn't seen anything, couldn't live with herself if tomorrow she read the news that a child had been found dead in the woods, and she had been the only person who could have done something and had chosen to keep driving. She was a nurse. She'd sworn to save lives, and tonight she was going to keep that oath. Ellie moved like a shadow among the ancient oak trunks. From this tree to the next, from this boulder to that thicket, always keeping a distance of about 30 m from the man ahead. Close enough not to lose him, far enough not to be seen. She stepped on soft earth layered with rotting leaves, avoiding dry branches that could snap underfoot with a sharp crack. Every footfall was calculated. Every breath was restrained. This was what her father had taught her. This was what she'd once hated, and this was what was keeping her alive. The man in front moved fast, faster than she'd expected, with a child in his arms. His breathing was heavy, rasping in the still night. Now and then he stopped and looked back as if he could feel someone watching him. Each time Ellie slipped deeper into the dark, becoming part of the forest, motionless as a tree stump. Then it happened. The man stopped dead. He spun around, his eyes sweeping the woods behind him. Ellie threw herself behind a large boulder, her back pressed to the ice-cold surface slick with moss. She covered her mouth with both hands, not daring to breathe. Her heart hammered as if it wanted to burst through her ribs. She could hear it. Thud, 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 and she was afraid the man could hear it too. 10 seconds passed. 10 seconds of absolute silence stretched like 10 minutes. Ellie didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't think. She simply existed. Part of the stone, part of the night. Then she heard the man's voice muttering to himself, just a deer. Footsteps sounded again, fading into the distance. Ellie let out a shaking breath she didn't know she'd been holding for how long. Her hands trembled, her legs trembled, her whole body trembled, but she still rose, still kept following. They pushed through the woods for nearly 90 minutes, about 2 mi of night forest, over jagged mountain slopes, across dry stream beds, through thorny brush that tore the legs of her scrubs. Ellie didn't know how much longer she could keep going. Her feet throbbed from the weight of the long day. Her stomach growled with hunger. Her eyes stung from sleeplessness and from strain, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Then the forest suddenly opened into a small clearing and the cabin appeared in front of her. It sat there like a ghost in the night. Old wooden walls rotten and pocked with termite scars. A rusted tin roof punched through in places, windows with no glass. Only empty wooden frames staring into the darkness like the eye sockets of a skull. No one had lived here in years, maybe decades. It was the perfect place to hide someone. Perfect for doing things you didn't want anyone to know about. Ellie noticed one important detail. The cabin was built on uneven ground, which left the underside of it fairly high, about 1/2 meter, high enough for a person to lie beneath it without being seen. She stored that away. The man stopped at the cabin door and kicked it hard. The rotten door flew open with a horrifying creak. He stepped inside with the child still limp in his arms. The door closed behind him. Ellie quickly found a place to watch. She moved toward a decaying log about 20 m from the cabin, where wild brush would conceal her, but still give her a clear line of sight to the empty front window frame. She lay flat against the ground, slowed her breathing, and waited. From here, she could see into the cabin through the window with no glass. A weak light began to flicker inside, maybe an oil lamp or a candle, and there were shadows moving. Ellie had found the place where the child was being held. She'd followed the kidnapper all the way to his lair. Now what? She had no gun, no knife, no phone to call for help. She had only a flashlight, a few protein bars, a bottle of water, and a lighter. She was only an exhausted nurse in a freezing night forest, but she was the only person who knew where the child was, and she wasn't going to leave. Not now, not when she'd come this far. Ellie lay there in the dark, her eyes locked on the cabin, and waited for the kidnapper's next move. She needed to know more, needed to understand what was happening, needed to find a way to save the child, even if she didn't know how. Not yet. A weak yellow light began to spread inside the cabin. The man had lit an old oil lamp and hung it from a rusted hook in the ceiling. The light danced across the rotting wooden walls, throwing strange black shadows that hopped and jerked like ghosts. From her place behind the decayed log, Ellie could see everything clearly through the empty window frame. She watched the man set the child down on the wooden floor, and for the first time, she saw the victim of this abduction in full. It was a little boy, about 7 years old, black hair, pale skin, an angel's face, even in unconsciousness. He wore navy blue pajamas printed with small rockets, the kind of sleepwear any child would love. One sock had been lost somewhere along the way, leaving a tiny foot exposed, white with cold. But the detail that made Ellie's heart tighten was what the boy still clutched in his hand, even while unconscious. A navy blue teddy bear, old and worn, clearly loved for many years. Even in a mindless state, the boy didn't let go of that bear, as if it were the last thread tying him to safety, to family, to the ordinary world he'd just been ripped away from. Ellie swallowed hard, trying to hold back the surge rising in her chest. She'd seen plenty of children in the emergency room, children hurt in accidents, children sick beyond what should be possible. Children dying, but she'd never seen a child in a situation like this. Kidnapped, carried deep into the woods, completely helpless. Then the boy began to stir. His head turned slightly, his fingers curled, tightening around the teddy bear. He was waking up, his eyes opened, dazed and confused. For the first few seconds, he looked around as if he couldn't understand where he was. Then, awareness crashed down and fear appeared in those young eyes, so raw and so painful. Ellie had to bite her lip to keep from crying out, but what happened next was what froze Ellie completely. The boy opened his mouth, his voice small and trembling, and he said, "Uncle Warren, where am I? I want to go back to my dad, Uncle." The boy was calling the man Uncle. Ellie's blood ran cold. This wasn't a stranger, not some random criminal snatching children off the road. This was family. This was kin. And that made everything 100 times worse because strangers kidnap children for money for dark purposes you could at least imagine. But a relative kidnapping his own nephew, that could only come from one place. Hatred, deep, personal, and more dangerous than anything else. The man, Warren, didn't answer the boy's question. He only walked silently to a corner of the cabin and pulled out a coil of rope from his backpack. Then he turned back, grabbed the boy by the arm, and yanked him to his feet. The boy screamed from pain and terror, "You're hurting me. I want to go home. I want my dad." Warren said nothing. He dragged the boy to the only wooden chair in the cabin, an old crooked chair that looked like it could collapse at any moment. He shoved the boy down, then began to tie him. Rope wrapped around his small torso, binding him to the chair, while his wrists were tied tightly together in front of him. The boy cried louder, "It hurts, Uncle, it hurts." Then the rope circled his ankles, binding them to the chair legs. Now the boy couldn't move, couldn't run, couldn't do anything except sit there and cry, and Warren still didn't speak. He only took a piece of cloth from his jacket pocket and stuffed it into the boy's mouth. The boy's sobs were strangled down to muffled, desperate sounds in the struggle. The teddy bear slipped from the boy's hand and rolled across the wooden floor, coming to rest a few inches from his feet. The boy looked down at the bear with eyes full of tears, but he couldn't reach it, couldn't do anything, could only watch his one friend lying there, just out of reach. Ellie clenched her fists until her nails cut into her palms. She could feel warm blood seeping out, but she didn't care. That physical pain was nothing compared to the pain in her chest. The nurse inside her was screaming, "Go in, save the child." That was what she'd been trained to do: save lives, protect the vulnerable. Don't stand there while someone suffers, but reason said otherwise. If she rushed in now, she would die and the boy would die too. Warren was bigger than she was, stronger than she was, and he might have a weapon. She had nothing to defend herself, nothing to fight with. If she was discovered, neither of them would survive. She had to wait, had to learn more, had to understand what was really happening here. Why would a man kidnap his own nephew? Why bring him to an abandoned cabin deep in the forest? And most of all, what did he plan to do to the boy? Ellie lay there in the darkness, her eyes locked on the window frame. She didn't know the answers yet. Not yet. But she would find out. She had to, because the child in that cabin was depending on her. Even if he didn't know it, even if no one knew it, only Ellie knew where he was and only Ellie could save him. Warren began pacing through the cabin like a beast trapped in a pen, from this corner to that one, from this window to the next. His heavy steps made the rotting floorboards groan beneath him. In his hand was a bottle of whiskey, already nearly half gone. He drank straight from it. Long, greedy pulls as if he were trying to drown something. Then he started to talk. Not to the boy tied to the chair, but to himself, to the darkness, to the 12 years of resentment boiling in his gut. You don't understand, do you? Warren stopped in front of the boy, but his eyes looked through him as if he were staring at something farther away. Your father, my perfect brother, the great Jay Sterling. He spat the name as if it were poison on his tongue. He took everything from me. Everything. The boy, Miles, could only sit there and tremble. The cloth gag kept him from speaking, from asking, from doing anything except listening. Tears ran down his cheeks, but Warren didn't care. He kept talking, his voice growing more bitter by the second. 12 years ago, I made a mistake, just one mistake. I needed money. Who doesn't need money? I sold a little information. Nothing major. No one died. Just a few small details in exchange for some cash. Warren laughed, a sound with no joy in it at all. But Jace, my kind-hearted brother, he found out. And what did he do? He told father. He took another long swallow, then wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. Grandfather cast me out, disowned me, acted like I'd never existed. 12 years. You know that 12 years I lived like a stray dog in the street while your father sat on the throne. Everything, power, money, respect, all of it belonged to Jace. And me? Warren spread his arms, gesturing at the rotten cabin around them. I have nothing. Outside the cabin, Ellie listened to every word, and she began to understand. This wasn't a random kidnapping. This was a war between brothers, a war that had smoldered for 12 years and was finally erupting, and that innocent child, Miles, was nothing but a pawn on their board. Warren stopped abruptly. He pulled a phone from his jacket, a cheap burner people used and tossed. He stepped up to the boy, lifted the phone, and took a picture. The click in the silence sounded like a gunshot. The flash made the boy flinch, curling in on himself in the chair. Done, Warren muttered, his finger sliding across the screen. Let's see how much your dear father loves you, he typed a message, reading every word aloud as he entered it. $5 million, $72 hours, no police or your son dies. Then he hit send. Done. He shoved the phone back into his pocket and took another swallow of whiskey. Now we wait. Ellie let out a shallow breath. Ransom. This was ransom. $5 million to buy the child back. That meant if the boy's father paid, the boy would be released. That meant the boy would be safe. That meant she had 72 hours. A small, fragile hope began to rise in her chest. All she had to do was keep him alive for 72 hours. All his father had to do was pay. Everything would be all right. Then Warren dropped to his knees in front of the boy, and every shred of Ellie's hope shattered. Warren's voice lowered, almost a whisper, but clear enough for Ellie to hear through the empty window frame. Your father thinks money can save you. Warren said it slowly, each word like a bullet. He's wrong. Miles stared at his uncle, eyes wide with terror, not understanding. I'll take the money, Warren went on, his voice ice cold. And I'll still kill you. Ellie's heart stopped. No, it couldn't be. She had to have heard wrong because money can't make up for the 12 years I lost. Warren kept talking, his voice now thick with poison. 12 years living like a sewer rat, 12 years watching my brother have everything while I had nothing. 12 years being treated like trash. He lifted a hand and smoothed the boy's hair. A fake tenderness that made Ellie want to vomit. Money can't fix that. But him losing you, his only son, the only blood left of Catherine Warren, laughed, a crazed smile twisting his mouth. That will make him understand how much I've suffered. Miles began to cry harder, the sound strangled behind the gag. He understood. Even at 7 years old, he understood what his uncle had just said. Warren stood, stepped away, and drank again. 72 hours, he said, cold and final. Whether your father pays or not, you're not going home. This cabin's been abandoned for 15 years. No one knows it exists. By the time they find it, you'll have been buried deep in the ground for a long time. Ellie lay outside the cabin, her body rigid as stone. Her hands were numb. The blood in her veins felt like it had turned to ice. She wanted to scream, wanted to rush into the cabin and kill the madman, wanted to wrap the boy in her arms and tell him everything would be okay. But she couldn't do any of it. She could only lie there in the darkness and face the brutal truth. This child was going to die. Whether his father paid or not, whether the police found this place or not, Warren had decided from the beginning the boy would die. And she, Eleanor Brennan, a 27-year-old nurse exhausted in a freezing night forest, was the only person on Earth who knew that truth. No one else, only her. She stared at the cabin, at the boy crying, at the teddy bear lying on the floor just out of his reach. And she knew. She couldn't leave, couldn't call the police and hope they arrived in time, couldn't do anything except stay here and find a way to save him herself. 72 hours. She had 72 hours and she wasn't going to let that child die. Ellie lay there in the darkness, her mind spinning with what she'd just heard. She could leave right now. Get up, make her way back to the car, drive until she found cell service. Call the police. It was the most sensible thing to do. It was what anyone would tell her to do. But she couldn't. And not because she was brave or because she wanted to be a hero, but because simple logic wouldn't allow it. She'd walked through the night for nearly 90 minutes, completely focused on tracking the man ahead of her, never once marking her path. She didn't know exactly which direction she'd gone, where she'd turned, what she'd crossed. Trying to go back in the dark could take hours, or she could get lost, completely lost, deep in the woods, alone. And even if she found her way back to the car, it would take 2 to 3 hours. Then she'd have to drive to where there was reception, another hour, then call the police, then explain she could already picture that conversation. An exhausted nurse after hours of standing, calling at 2 or 3 in the morning, saying she'd seen a man carrying a child into the woods, that she'd followed them to an abandoned cabin whose exact location she couldn't name, and that the man intended to kill the child whether or not he got the ransom money. Would the police believe her immediately, or would they assume she was hallucinating from exhaustion? Would they take hours to verify before they acted? Altogether, it could take 8 to 10 hours. And in 8 to 10 hours, Warren could do anything. He could wake up, sense something, and move the boy somewhere else, another cabin, a cave, anywhere. And then no one on Earth would know where Miles was, no one except Warren. She was the only thread, the only witness who knew the precise location of this cabin. If she left and couldn't find her way back, the child would die for sure. Not might die, would die. Ellie closed her eyes, forcing herself to control her breathing as it rushed in her chest. She had no other choice. She had to stay. Had to find a way to save the boy somehow, any way she could. The sound of the cabin door opening snapped her back to the present. Warren stepped outside, the bottle still in his hand. "I'm going to check around," he called to the boy inside, his voice thick with whiskey. "Set a few traps. Don't you even think about running?" Then he vanished into the darkness, his heavy footsteps fading away. Ellie waited. 1 minute, 2, Warren's footsteps disappeared completely into the night forest. This was her chance. She moved fast but silent, crawling from behind the rotting log toward the cabin. She remembered the important detail she'd noted earlier. The underside of the cabin was high, about 1/2 meter, because it had been built on uneven ground, high enough for a person to lie beneath it. She slipped under the cabin, feeling the cold, damp earth against her stomach. The smell of mildew and rotten wood filled her nose, but she didn't care. She crawled forward, searching in the dark until she found it. A gap between the floorboards, wide enough to look up, wide enough to speak through. She pressed her face to the crack and looked up, and she saw the boy, Miles, sitting there in the chair, wrists tied, mouth gagged, eyes swollen red from crying. He looked so small, so fragile, 7 years old, only 7, and already facing something this terrible. "Hey, kid," Ellie whispered, her voice as light as breath. Miles flinched, his eyes going wide with terror as he looked down at the floor. He didn't understand where the voice was coming from. He only knew someone was there, and that made him more afraid. "Don't be scared," Ellie said. "Faster now, don't yell, I'm under the cabin floor, I'm here to help you." Miles stared down at the crack and his eyes met Ellie's, green and warm, looking up from the darkness below. For the first time since he'd been taken, the boy saw something that wasn't fear. "Hope. What's your name?" Ellie asked, keeping her voice steady and gentle, the way she spoke to frightened children in the emergency room. "Miles." His voice shook behind the cloth gag, muffled but still understandable. "Miles, my name's Ellie. I'm a nurse. I saw your uncle bring you here and I'm going to find a way to get you out." Tears slid down the boy's cheeks again. "Uncle Warren wants to kill me." He sobbed, his voice breaking. "I heard him say it. I'm going to die." Ellie swallowed. She knew she shouldn't promise what she wasn't sure she could deliver. That was a rule she'd learned in nursing school. Don't promise the impossible. Don't create false hope. But looking into the boy's terrified eyes through the crack in the floor, looking at the small hands straining toward the teddy bear lying just out of reach, looking at a 7-year-old who believed he was going to die. Ellie couldn't say anything else. "Miles, listen to me," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. "I promise you, I won't leave you. No matter what happens, I'll be here. Do you trust me?" Miles looked at her at the green eyes peering up through the floorboards. Then he nodded slowly, but for certain. "Now you have to pretend nothing's happening." Ellie went on. "When your uncle comes back, don't look down at the floor. Don't let him know I'm here. I'll be right underneath. Do you understand?" Miles nodded again, then his gaze shifted to the teddy bear on the floor, a few inches from his feet but out of reach of his bound hands. "Captain," he whispered, his voice full of longing. Ellie understood. She reached through the crack, her fingers brushing the wood above as she searched. Then she found the teddy bear. She nudged it little by little until it rolled toward Miles's feet. The boy used his foot to push it up, then bent down and used his teeth to pull it into his lap. He clutched it tight, like he was holding the whole world. "Captain's going to stay with you," Ellie whispered. "And so am I promise." 20 minutes after Warren hit send, more than 50 m away, Jay Sterling's phone began to vibrate. The Sterling estate sat on a hill overlooking the valley, a massive piece of architecture built with the money and blood of 3 generations. Inside his private study, Jay Sterling sat behind an old oak desk, reviewing business reports from his operations. 36 years old, standing at 62 with black hair cut short and neat. His gaze was unyielding, carrying the weight of a man who had seen too much. A faint scar ran from his left temple down to his cheekbone. A souvenir from a failed assassination attempt 5 years earlier. When some fool thought he could take the life of the boss of the Sterling underworld empire, that fool was now under 3 meters of earth. And Jace was still here, still controlling everything on the East Coast, still the name the entire underworld treated with caution. The phone vibrated, an unknown number. Jace frowned, but he opened the message anyway, and his world collapsed. On the screen was a picture of Miles, his son, his only child. The last blood Catherine had left him before she was gone. Miles was tied to a wooden chair. A cloth gagged his mouth. His eyes were swollen red from crying. Captain lay at his feet like a taunt. Beneath the picture was the message: $5 million, $72 hours, no police or your son dies. Jay stood there motionless as stone. He didn't scream. He didn't smash anything. He didn't do any of the things an ordinary man would do when he learned his child had been taken because Jay Sterling wasn't ordinary. Everyone in the underworld knew that. Jay Sterling never showed weakness, never let an enemy see a soft spot. Never, but Conrad Thorne saw it. Conrad, Jace's right hand for 15 years, the man who'd walked through hell with him and come back, stood in the corner of the room and saw what no one else saw. Jace's hand trembled slightly. Just a little, almost imperceptible, but Conrad noticed. And Jace's gray eyes, those steel-cold eyes Conrad had known for 15 years, were burning now with a fire. A fire Conrad had only seen once before. The night Catherine was killed. "Let me see it," Conrad said, stepping to Jace's side. He took the phone, zoomed in on the image, studied every detail. A dark room, old wooden walls, weak oil lamplight, nothing special until Conrad looked at the way Miles was tied. He went still. "This knot," Conrad said slowly, his eyes locked on the picture. "This is how the old man taught us when we were kids." Jace looked closer, and he saw it. The signature knot of the Sterling family, the way their father had taught 2 brothers when they were young, a way of tying that only family knew. "There's only one person besides you who knows this knot," Conrad said, his voice tight, Jace's jaw locked. Warren, the name left his mouth like a curse. Warren, his brother, the man he'd thought he would never see again. 12 years earlier, Warren had been caught selling information to a rival. Their father had wanted to handle it permanently, kill Warren to protect the family's secrets. But Jace had begged for his brother's life. Blood was blood. A brother was still a brother. Warren had been cast out, stripped of everything, and disappeared. 12 years. Jace had thought he would never see Warren again. He'd been wrong. "Mobilize everyone," Jace said, his voice ice cold. "Every man, every resource," Conrad nodded, already pulling out his phone to call, but he stopped long enough to ask one question. "The police?" "No," Jace said immediately. "Warren will kill Miles if he sees the police. We handle this ourselves." Conrad began making calls, issuing orders to the men under him. At Clear's throat the same time, he spread a large map across the desk, a map of the Blue Ridge area. "If this is Warren," Conrad said, his finger moving over the map, "he'll choose the most remote place he can, somewhere no one will find. The Blue Ridge has more than 500,000 acres of forest, hundreds of abandoned cabins. He picked a place like that on purpose." Conrad looked up at Jace, worry in his eyes, finding him in 72 hours. "Then we have 72 hours. Jace cut in, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Bring in 50 men, 2 helicopters, split the area, check every cabin if we have to." "But boss, 500,000 acres," Conrad began. "What did I say?" Jace turned to Conrad. And Jace's gray eyes weren't cold anymore. They were blazing. "That's my son, my only son. Catherine's last blood." He stepped closer, towering over his right hand by nearly a full head. I'll turn over every rock, burn down every forest, kill anyone in my way if I have to, but I will find my son. And Warren Jace paused, his jaw grinding. Warren will wish 12 years ago I'd let father kill him. Start now. Conrad didn't say another word. He only nodded and moved. The race against time had begun, 72 hours, and the clock was counting down. Heavy footsteps sounded from the direction of the trees, and Ellie quickly curled tighter beneath the cabin, holding her breath. Warren was coming back. He shoved the cabin door open and staggered inside with the unsteady gait of a man who'd had too much to drink. Ellie could hear him check on Miles, mutter a few words that didn't make sense, then the groan of wood as he sat down in a corner of the room. A bottle cap popped. Whiskey glugged into his mouth. Then Warren started talking, his speech thick and bitter. Jace Sterling, the perfect brother, father's favorite son. He spat each word like poison. 12 years. 12 years I lived like a stray dog while you sat on the throne. But now it's different. Now you're going to learn what it feels like to lose the thing you treasure most. The muttering went on, braided with the sound of drinking for hours. Slowly, Warren's voice grew slower, more broken. Then it stopped altogether. Only a soft snore remained. Ellie waited another 10 minutes, counting each second in her head, making sure Warren was truly asleep. Then she moved. She turned her phone off to save the battery, keeping it only for a moment of real need. She slid out from under the cabin and slipped into the night forest. She needed water. She needed food. She needed to survive long enough to save Miles. The survival skills her father had drilled into her as a child became her lifeline now. She listened, and she caught the sound of water trickling somewhere in the distance. She moved toward it, careful with every step, and found a small stream about 100 meters from the cabin. The water-clear's throat was clear and cold. She drank until she was full, then refilled the bottle she carried. Next came food. She reached back to her father's lessons. Some roots could be eaten. She searched in the dark, feeling along the bases of trees, and found a few safe tubers and roots. Not good, but enough to keep her going. The cold was the worst enemy. Her thin scrubs weren't enough for an October night in the mountains. She shook violently, her teeth chattering hard, but she couldn't light a fire. She couldn't let Warren know someone was close. She could only endure it. When she was sure Warren was still deep asleep, Ellie crawled back under the cabin and pressed her face to the crack in the floor. "Miles," she whispered. "Miss Ellie." A small, trembling voice answered, but there was a hint of relief in it. Ellie slid her hand up through the gap and pushed through half a protein bar and the cap of the water bottle she'd filled from the stream. She kept most of it for Miles, taking only a little for herself. "Eat, Miles, keep your strength." The boy tried to reach the food with his tied hands, struggling, but he managed. He ate in small bites, drank in careful sips, his eyes never leaving the crack where Ellie's green eyes looked up at him. When he finished, Miles whispered, his voice suddenly serious in a way that didn't belong to a 7-year-old. "Ms. Ellie." "Uncle Warren keeps his phone in his jacket pocket, and when he gets drunk, he sleeps really hard. He has a knife too, but he sleeps really hard." Ellie was startled. She hadn't expected the boy to be watching so closely. "You're a good observer," she said, her voice full of surprise and a quiet, proud warmth. "My dad taught me," Miles said, "and even here, even now." There was a note of pride when he spoke of his father. "Dad says you always have to pay attention. You have to remember everything because you never know when that information will be useful." Ellie smiled in the darkness. "Your dad taught you right," she said. "Miles, can you keep watching for me? Where he goes, what he does, when he sleeps, when he wakes, anything you notice that feels strange, tell me." Miles nodded, and even though Ellie couldn't see it in the dark, she could hear the determination in his voice. "I'll try. I'll help you, Miss Ellie." "That's good," Ellie whispered, her chest warming a little in the freezing night. "You're braver than a lot of grown men I know." She lay there beneath the cabin, listening to Warren snoring through the rotten boards overhead. She shook from cold. Her stomach growled with hunger even after the roots she'd eaten. Her whole body ached with exhaustion after days of relentless physical strain. But she didn't leave. She'd promised. Her resolve was the only thing keeping her upright in the numbing cold. Above her, Miles clutched Captain tight, his eyes drifting down toward the crack in the floor where Miss Ellie lay. For the first time since he'd been taken, the boy didn't feel completely alone. He had Captain and he had Miss Ellie, and he would be brave the way his father had taught him. The second day began with a dull gray light seeping through the canopy. Ellie hadn't slept much, maybe only an hour or two stolen between fits of shivering from the cold, but she was still alert, still watching, still planning. With the information Miles fed her through the crack in the floor, she began to grasp Warren's daily pattern. Early morning around 6, he left the cabin to fetch water from the stream. Gone about 20 minutes. At midday, he went to check the traps he'd set around the cabin. Gone about 30 minutes. In the afternoon, he fetched water again, 20 minutes. And at night, he drank until he drifted into a half-sleep, the bottle in one hand and the knife in the other. Those gaps were her chance. The times Warren left the cabin were the moment she could act. But the biggest question still kept circling in Ellie's mind. Why hadn't Warren discovered her? She'd been here nearly 24 hours, moving around the cabin, even lying right beneath it, and he still had no idea. The answer came slowly as she watched him more closely. First, he was too confident. Warren believed no one in the world knew this place existed. The cabin had been abandoned for 15 years, not on any modern map. He'd chosen it for its absolute isolation. In his mind, there was no chance anyone had happened to pass by and see him carrying a child. Second, he was severely unstable. The alcohol. Warren drank constantly from morning to night. He was never fully sober, never clear-headed enough to check his surroundings carefully. He checked only the traps he'd already set, and he never imagined someone could be watching from so close. Third, his mind was locked on one thing, Jace. Revenge on his brother. That was all he thought about. 12 years of resentment had turned him into an obsessed man, unable to see anything beyond his need to retaliate. And finally, Ellie was careful. She approached the cabin only when Warren was deep asleep or far away. The rest of the time, she stayed 50 to 100 meters back, hidden in dense brush, moving like a shadow. But she couldn't wait forever. She needed a plan, a real plan. The idea came when she remembered her father's lessons. 3 fires arranged in a triangle were an international distress signal. Any pilot or rescue team would recognize it. If anyone was searching for Miles, if his father had alerted the police or sent men out, 3 columns of smoke would lead them here. And even if no one was searching, 3 columns of smoke would still draw attention. Planes, helicopters, anyone who saw them. Ellie began to act in the morning when Warren went for water. She moved fast but silent, searching for higher points on the mountainside. She found 3 perfect positions 200 to 500 m from the cabin, forming a clear triangle. At each point, she gathered dry branches and dead leaves, building a pile ready to ignite. She also left markers along the way, using a sharp stone to carve arrow signs into tree trunks, pointing toward the cabin, tearing strips of cloth from her jacket, and tying them to branches where they'd be easily seen. If anyone was searching, they'd see these signs. They'd know the way. By now, Ellie's jacket had been nearly shredded. Only ragged strips remained, not enough to keep her warm. All she had left was her thin scrubs, the kind she wore in the clinic, never meant for a cold October night in the mountains. On the second night, the cold came for her more brutally than it had the first. She shivered so hard, her teeth clattered without stopping. She could feel her fingers and toes going numb, her vision blurred, and every breath felt like inhaling broken glass, but she refused to succumb to the cold. Her body was beginning to slip toward hypothermia. She knew that she was a nurse, but she still didn't leave. Miss Ellie Miles's voice came through the crack in the floor, full of worry. "Are you cold? I can hear your teeth chattering." Ellie tried to control the shaking, though it was useless. "I'm fine, Miles," she lied, her voice trembling. "You worry about yourself. Are you warm? Are you okay? I'm okay. I have Captain," Miles said. "But Miss Ellie, you have to stay warm. Dad says it's not good if people shiver too much." "Your dad's right," Ellie whispered, smiling even as the cold sank into her bones. "But I'm going to be okay. I promised you. Remember, I'm not leaving you." Silence for a moment. Then Miles's voice came again, small but steady. "I believe you." Ellie lay there in the dark, her body shaking without pause. The plan was ready. The 3 fire piles had been built. The trail markers were in place. The old Zippo was still in her pocket. She only needed the right moment, but she was exhausted, hungry, cold to the bone. She didn't know how much longer she could endure it, but she would because she'd promised. While Ellie was shivering beneath the cabin in the freezing night, 50 of Jay Sterling's men were spreading through the Blue Ridge region like an army. 2 helicopters swept overhead, their searchlights punching holes through the darkness, hunting for any sign of life in an endless sea of green. But 500,000 acres of forest was too big. Too big to find a single small cabin. Too big to find a 7-year-old child. Too big to find hope. The first 24 hours passed with nothing to show for it. Then the first lead appeared. One of Jace's men, a tracker named Marco, found an old car parked at an abandoned gas station 15 mi from the Blue Ridge. The car was coated in dust, clearly left there for at least a day. Marco reported over the radio, excitement in his voice for the first time after hours of fruitless searching. The car is registered under a fake name, but I recognize the alias. Warren used it 10 years ago, back when he still worked for the family. Jason Conrad arrived within 30 minutes. Conrad spread a map across the hood, shining a flashlight over it, his finger moving along the paper. From this gas station on foot through the woods, he could reach the western side of the mountain area, Conrad said, drawing a circle on the map. About 50 square miles. Still dozens of abandoned cabins in that range. Someone on the team spoke up, frustration heavy in his voice. Dozens of cabins, and we've only got 48 hours left. Then we check every single one, Jace said, cold and final, leaving no room for argument. Split the team. Each group takes a sector. Check every cabin, every shack, every place a man could shelter. Don't miss anything. The team started to move, but a new member, young, maybe only 22 or 23, muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. Maybe we should call the police. They have more resources. Thermal helicopters, K9 units, everyone froze. A dead silence dropped over them. Jace turned slowly. And the look he gave the young man made even the hardest men flinch. Gray eyes, ice cold with a fire burning underneath. The police show up. Warren knows. Miles dies. Jace said, each word falling like a hammer. Any other questions? The young man swallowed and shook his head, eyes lowered. No one said another word. The team moved again and Jace climbed into his black SUV. Conrad taking the wheel. They drove to the first cabin on the list. Then the second, then the third. Each time Jace stepped inside himself to check. Each time he walked back out with his eyes a little emptier. Nothing. No sign of Warren, no sign of Miles. Between searches, as Conrad drove the SUV along rough, dirt roads, Jace sat in the back seat staring at his phone, not at messages from Warren, at a photograph. Miles and Catherine taken a year before she died. Miles was 6 then, grinning wide, both arms wrapped around his mother's neck. Catherine looked into the camera, her eyes bright with happiness, never knowing that 1 year later she would die in a car crash. Jace had always suspected was not an accident. I promised I'd protect him, Jace whispered to the picture, his voice gone rough. I promised you. He remembered the night Catherine lay in the hospital bed, the last hours before she slipped away, her hand in his weak but still trying to squeeze. Keep him safe, she'd whispered, her voice breaking. That's the only thing I need. Jace had promised. He'd promised he would protect Miles with his life. And now his son was out there somewhere in the hands of a madman who meant to kill him for revenge. He had failed. Failed Catherine. Failed Miles, failed himself. Conrad glanced in the rearview mirror, saw Jace's face, and decided to break the silence. We're going to find the boy. Boss, Conrad said, sounding more certain than he truly felt. Jace didn't answer right away. He stared out the window into the night, blanketing the Blue Ridge forest. 12 years ago, I spared Warren because he was my brother, Jace said, his voice low and distant. I thought it was mercy. Father wanted him dead, but I begged for his life. I thought I was doing the right thing. Conrad stayed quiet, waiting. Jace looked back down at the photo on his phone, at his son's face. Now I know it was the biggest mistake of my life. The SUV kept cutting through the night toward the next cabin on the list. The clock was still counting down, 48 hours. And Jay Sterling was more desperate than he had ever been. The second night fell over the Blue Ridge like a black curtain, and inside the cabin, Warren Sterling was losing control. He stared at the burner phone, waiting for a reply from Jace. But there was nothing, not a single word, not one response, as if Jace were ignoring him completely. As if Jace's son wasn't worth answering a message. Warren threw the phone to the floor, then picked it up, then threw it down again. He finished his third bottle of whiskey, paced the cabin like a wild animal trapped in a cage. His heavy steps made the wooden floor tremble. He thinks he can look down on me, Warren roared, his voice cracked with madness. He thinks I'm joking. Me, his brother, the one he shoved out into the street like a dog, he thinks I won't do it. He kicked an empty chair into the wall, punched the rotten planks until his hand bled, spat curses and filthy words. 12 years of resentment bursting loose, impossible to contain. Ellie lay beneath the cabin, her heart pounding as if it wanted to explode. She could hear everything above her, the footsteps, the blows, the shouting, and she knew something terrible was coming. Then Warren stopped. He looked at Miles, curled on the chair, eyes raw from crying and lack of sleep. You want me to prove I'm serious? Jace Warren muttered, his voice suddenly calm in a way that was frightening. Fine, I'll show you. He strode to Miles, cut the rope that held him to the chair, then grabbed the boy by the collar and yanked him to his feet. Miles screamed from pain and fear, but Warren didn't care. He pulled out the phone, turned on the camera, then pressed the knife close to Miles's throat. Not touching, but close enough for the steel to flash in the oil lamp light. "Listen to me," Jace Warren shouted into the camera, his eyes bloodshot from whiskey and hate. 8 hours left. You don't pay, you'll never see your son again. You hear me? Never. Then he turned to Miles, his voice like thunder. "Say it, tell your father." Miles shook so hard he could barely stand. Tears ran down his cheeks mixed with snot. He tried to open his mouth, tried to speak, but terror squeezed his throat shut. "Dad." His voice came out thin, broken. "I'm scared. I want to go home. Dad, please save me." Warren ended the video by shoving Miles hard. The boy hit the wooden floor, groaning in pain. Captain the teddy bear flew out of his grasp, rolled a few feet, and stopped in a corner of the cabin out of reach. Warren hit send, then tossed the phone aside, turning back to a new bottle. He sat in the corner, drank, muttered, and slowly sank into another drunken fog. Miles lay on the floor, his hands still tied behind his back. He stared toward Captain, the only teddy bear, his only friend, the last thread connecting him to normal life. He tried to crawl toward it using his elbows and knees, but the ropes made moving almost impossible. He tried. He tried with everything he had, but Captain stayed there, a few feet away, out of reach. The boy stopped, exhausted, and began to cry. Not screaming now, a quiet, hopeless sob, the sound of a child who had lost everything. Ellie saw it all from beneath the cabin. She covered her mouth with both hands so she wouldn't scream. Tears ran down her cheeks and fell onto the cold ground beneath her. Every cell in her body was screaming, "Go up there, take the knife from him, hold the child, do something, anything." But she knew if she showed herself now, Warren would kill Miles immediately. No hesitation, no thought. She had no weapon, no way to win against a drunk man with a knife in his hand. If she was discovered, they would both die. So she lay there waiting and crying in silence. Then she heard snoring. Warren had fallen asleep. The chance was there. Ellie moved at once, crawling to the crack in the floor closest to where Captain lay. She reached up through the gap, her fingers brushing the boards above. She couldn't reach Miles. The boy was too far, but she could reach Captain. The teddy bear was within her reach. She nudged it gently, little by little, inch by inch, toward Miles, slowly, patiently, until the teddy bear touched the small hand tied behind the boy's back. Miles grabbed Captain like he was grabbing life itself. He nudged the teddy bear closer with his knees, resting his cheek against it on the cold floor, then looked down toward the crack, and he saw the familiar green eyes looking up. Ellie whispered almost soundless, only loud enough for Miles to hear. "I'm right here, Miles. I'm staying with you. Hold on a little longer. I promise." Miles nodded, tears still falling. But something else was in his eyes now. Hope. Small, fragile, but hope. Ellie lay back beneath the cabin, her heart still racing. She had watched Warren unravel. She had seen the knife at Miles's throat. She knew he was growing more unstable, more dangerous, more unpredictable by the hour. She couldn't wait any longer. Tomorrow. She had to act. Jace was sitting in the SUV, having just finished checking the 15th cabin on the list with nothing to show for it when his phone vibrated. Warren's number, but it wasn't a text. It was a video. Conrad at the wheel glanced over at Jace with worry in his eyes. Boss Jace didn't answer. He opened the video and his world collapsed again. On the small screen, Miles was crying. His son, the 7-year-old boy he loved more than his own life, was shaking in Warren's grip. A knife gleamed at the side of the boy's throat, so close that one startled movement could turn into tragedy. Warren's voice roared through the video, mad with hatred. 48 hours left. "Jace, you don't pay, you'll never see your son again." And then Miles's voice, thin and broken, so painful Jace felt as if someone were crushing his heart. "Dad, I'm scared. I want to go home. Dad, please save me." The video ended. The screen went black. Jace sat there motionless as stone. Conrad held his breath, waiting for rage, waiting for shouting, waiting for Jace to smash whatever he could reach. But none of it came. Jace only set the phone down slowly, calmly, in a way that was terrifying. His hand clenched on his thigh, clenched until his knuckles went bone white. Silence stretched. 1 second, 2, 10. Then Jace spoke, his voice so low it was almost a whisper, but so cold Conrad felt a chill even inside the warm vehicle. "Find my son and bring Warren to me." Conrad nodded. Then he asked carefully, "Alive or dead?" "Alive," Jace said without a flicker of hesitation. Conrad was surprised. He'd expected Jace to want Warren dead, to want him to die in pain, slow in Jace's own hands, but alive, death is too fast. "It's mercy," Jace said, as if he could read Conrad's thoughts. "Warren doesn't get mercy." Conrad didn't ask anything else. He didn't need to. He'd been at Jace's side long enough to know what waited for Warren when they found him. There were things far worse than death. Jace picked up the phone and replayed the video. This time, he didn't look at Miles, didn't look at Warren. He looked at the details around them. Oil lamp light, Jace said, eyes scanning frame by frame. No electricity, old wooden walls, gaps between the boards, an abandoned cabin. At least 10 years, maybe more. He paused the video and listened. Water, a stream, very faint, but you can hear it in the background. There's a water source nearby. He studied the angle of the light spilling in through the window in the video. Late afternoon light coming from the right side of the frame. West. That cabin has a west-facing window. Jace turned to Conrad. An abandoned cabin near a stream on the western side of the mountain area with a west-facing window. How tight does that make it? Conrad pulled out the map, marked quickly, calculating in his head. About 20 square miles. Maybe 12 to 15 cabins that fit. Then we check everyone within 48 hours, Jace said. Split the teams, one group per cabin. No rest, no sleep. Not until we find my son. Conrad nodded and pulled out his phone to contact the teams. Meanwhile, Jace stared out the window into the darkness covering the Blue Ridge Forest. They were close. He could feel it, but 48 hours. 48 hours could be a lifetime, or it could be nothing at all. Hold on, Miles, Jace whispered to the night. Your dad is coming. Dawn on the third day seeped through the treetops, tinting the eastern sky pink. Ellie lay beneath the cabin, her body stiff as a log. She couldn't feel the tips of her fingers or her toes anymore. Her lips were cracked from cold and dryness. Her body had shaken without stopping through the night. But now she didn't even have the strength to shiver. She knew what that meant. Hypothermia. If she didn't do something, she would die here under this cabin, only a few feet from Miles and still unable to save him. Above her, she could hear Warren's heavy snoring. He was dead drunk from the night before, lying unmoving on the cabin floor, an empty bottle rolling nearby. It would probably be hours before he woke. Ellie looked up at the sky, brightening through the gaps beneath the cabin. 72 hours were almost gone. If Miles's father was searching, if any rescue team was sweeping this forest, they wouldn't find this cabin in time. Not unless someone guided them. Not unless there was a signal. She remembered her father's lesson from almost 20 years earlier when she was 8 and he still hadn't left. 3 fires in a triangle. That's the international distress signal. Any pilot, any rescue team knows it. If you're lost in the woods and you want to be found, you light 3 fires. She had already prepared 3 piles of wood on 3 high points along the mountainside the day before. Dry branches, dead leaves, ready to burn. She still had the old Zippo in her pocket. Now was the time. Ellie drew a deep breath, gathering every scrap of strength left in her exhausted body. Then she crawled out from under the cabin, rose on shaking legs, and began to run. The first point was about 200 m north of the cabin on a high rock outcrop. She ran through brush over fallen trunks, not caring about the noise she made. Warren was drunk. She had time. She had to have time. She reached the first point, gasping, hands shaking as she pulled the Zippo from her pocket. The first flick didn't catch. The second didn't either. The tiny flame refused to hold. Please burn, Ellie whispered, her voice raw with desperation. Please burn. The third try, the flame leapt up. She touched it to the dry leaves and the fire caught at once. It spread fast, climbing the branches, surging into a larger blaze. Gray smoke rose high, straight into the clear morning sky. No time to watch, she turned and ran for the second point, 300 m to the west. Her legs ocked. Her lungs felt like they were going to burst, but she didn't stop. The second point lighted. The fire flared, smoke climbed. The third point, the highest hill, 500 m, she lost her shoes in the thick mud, scrambling up the steep incline, and she nearly had to crawl the last stretch, her vision blurring once more, but she refused to give in. She reached it. She lit the last pile, and when she stood there, gasping, staring up at the sky, she saw it. 3 columns of smoke on 3 ridge lines forming a perfect triangle against the blue, the international distress signal. If anyone was searching, they would see it. They had to see it. Then she heard a shout from the cabin. What the hell is that, Warren? He was awake. Ellie stumbled down the hill, searching for cover. She found a large boulder about 100 meters from the cabin and pressed herself behind it, fighting to control her racing breath. From here, she could see Warren burst out of the cabin, eyes bloodshot, hair wild, spinning as he looked around. He stared up at the sky, saw the 3 columns of smoke, and his face changed. Who's here? Warren roared, yanking out his knife, turning in circles like a cornered wild animal. Show yourself, I know someone's here. Ellie stayed perfectly still, not daring to breathe. Her heart slammed as if it wanted to break her ribs. Her hands shook uncontrollably. She had gambled everything. 3 columns of smoke were climbing into the sky, calling to anyone who might be searching. But at the same time, she had alerted Warren. He knew someone was close. He was hunting. And if he found her, Ellie closed her eyes and prayed. Prayed someone would see the signal. Prayed they would reach her in time. Prayed she hadn't just killed both herself and Miles with her own hands. There was no way back now, only waiting and hope. Jace's helicopter was flying over the western side of the Blue Ridge when the pilot suddenly spoke into the radio. "Mr. Sterling, we've got a signal." Jace lunged to the helicopter window, eyes sweeping the forest below, and he saw it. 3 pillars of smoke rising straight into the blue, forming a perfect triangle. Conrad followed Jace's line of sight and understood at once. "That's not a wildfire," Conrad said, his voice tight. "That's a distress signal. 3 points in a triangle. That's the international signal. Someone is calling us." Jace didn't hesitate. "Land as close as you can." He ordered the pilot, then turned to the radio to contact the ground teams. "All teams move to these coordinates immediately. I repeat, immediately." The helicopter banked, turning toward the 3 columns of smoke climbing into the sky. At the same time, on the ground, Warren Sterling was panicking. He stood in the clearing in front of the cabin, staring up at the sky, staring at the 3 columns of smoke. And he understood someone had called for help. Someone had alerted the outside world. His plan had been destroyed. The original plan had been simple. Hold Miles for 72 hours, take the money from Jace, then kill the child anyway. But now there was no time. They were coming and he had to move. "If I can't ransom you," Warren muttered, his bloodshot eyes spinning. "Then at least you'll still lose your son, Jace." He charged into the cabin and grabbed Miles, who was curled on the floor. The knife in his hand cut the rope that tied the boy to the chair, but left Miles's hands bound behind his back. "Move," Warren snarled, yanking Miles upright and dragging him outside. "I don't want to go," Miles cried, his feet trying to stick to the ground, his arms clutching Captain even though they were tied. "I want to stay here. They're coming to save me." "Shut up," Warren slapped the side of the boy's head, not hard enough to injure but hard enough to scare Miles into silence. "Move or you die right here." He hauled Miles toward the deep woods eastward, away from the cabin, away from the 3 columns of smoke, away from everything. Ellie watched it all from behind the boulder. She saw Warren drag Miles out of the cabin, saw the boy crying and begging, saw them disappear into the trees heading east, and she knew she couldn't let them go. If Warren escaped with Miles, everything she'd done would mean nothing. 3 nights without sleep, hunger, cold, nearly dying from hypothermia, all of it would mean nothing if she lost the boy now. Ellie left her hiding place and followed Warren and Miles. She kept a wider distance than before, maybe 50 m, far enough not to be seen, but close enough to keep them in sight. And as she moved, she kept leaving a trail. Her scrubs were nothing now but torn rags. She ripped the last strips away and tied them to branches along the route, 1 strip at a time, like small beacons marking a path through an endless sea of trees. 10 minutes later, Jay's team reached the cabin. Conrad and 10 men arrived first, guns in hand, moving fast but careful. They kicked the door open and rushed inside. Empty. No Warren, no Miles, only cut rope lying on the rotting floorboards. Footprints led out the door, then vanished eastward. Conrad reported over the radio. "Cabin is empty." Target moved east, pursuing. Then he saw it. A strip of fabric tied to a branch about 20 m from the cabin. Conrad stepped closer and looked carefully. Scrub fabric the kind nurses wore in hospitals. He looked farther. Another strip 20 m ahead, then another like a trail leading deep into the woods. Someone is leaving markers. Conrad spoke into the radio, surprise sharp in his voice. "And they're guiding us east." Jace heard it through the radio from the helicopter as it descended. "Who?" Conrad answered, "Don't know, but they're helping us. And they're moving the same direction as Warren. Follow the trail." Jay's voice came back hard as steel. "Follow it and move." Conrad's team surged forward, tracking the small strips of cloth cutting through the forest to the east. At the same time, Warren was still dragging Miles onward, unaware someone was shadowing him, and Ellie was still following, exhausted but refusing to stop, leaving strip after strip like whispers in the woods. "We're here. Follow us. Save the child." 3 forces were closing on the same point. Warren fleeing, Ellie tracking, and Jay's men gaining ground. The race against time was reaching its end. After 30 minutes of running through the forest, dragging along a child who was crying and begging, Warren stopped abruptly. There was no path ahead anymore, only open air. The edge of a cliff cut the trail off like a giant blade slicing through the earth. Below was a yawning drop, maybe hundreds of meters down. Jagged rocks jutted up from the ravine floor like the fangs of some creature waiting to swallow whatever fell. No one could survive a fall like that. Warren stood at the edge, looked down, then looked at Miles trembling beside him. And suddenly he laughed, a laugh that was cold and hollow and steeped in bitterness. "This is where Father used to bring the two of us camping," Warren said, his voice strangely calm, as if he were telling an old story to an old friend. "You know something, Miles. This is where Grandfather declared your father would inherit everything. The Sterling Empire, the money, the power, the respect, all of it." He stared into the ravine, his eyes distant. "And me, I was nothing. The spare, the shadow of the perfect brother. Grandfather didn't even look at me when he said those words, like I didn't exist." Miles sobbed, clutching Captain in his hands, bound behind his back, trying to back away from the cliff's edge. "Please, Uncle," the boy said, his voice breaking. "I didn't do anything to you. I'm just a kid. Please don't hurt me. I want to go home. I want my dad." Warren knelt and gripped Miles's chin, forcing the boy to look into his eyes. "You don't have to do anything," Warren said, his voice low and steady as wind over the cliff. "You just have to exist. You're Jace's son, his blood, the thing he loves most in the world." His eyes darkened, hatred and pain braided together. "And you not existing anymore will destroy him." "The way he destroyed my life," Warren stood, grabbed Miles by the collar and dragged him toward the edge. Miles screamed, feet clawing at the ground, fighting with all the small strength he had, but it was useless. Warren was too strong and Miles was only 7. "Stop!" The voice came from the treeane, clear and steady, cutting through the wind and Miles's crying. Warren froze. He spun around, eyes sweeping the trees, and he saw her. Ellie stepped out from the shade of the canopy and into the pale morning light. She looked like a ghost, so thin her cheekbones stood out sharp, filthy with mud and scratches all over her. Her scrubs were torn to rags, barely covering her. Her lips were purple with cold. Her hair was a tangled nest, but her eyes, her green eyes burning bright like 2 green flames, did not tremble. "Who are you?" Warren demanded, shock and confusion in his voice. "Where did you come from? I'm the one who's followed you for 3 days." Ellie said, her voice calmer than she expected, even though her heart was racing in her chest. "I'm the one who was under your cabin. I'm the one who kept this child alive with food and water while you drank yourself blind. I'm the one who lit the signal fires this morning, and I'm not going to let you kill him." Warren stared at her, then barked a laugh full of contempt with something uneasy underneath. "You," he looked her up and down, taking in her gaunt frame, her empty hands. "You've got nothing. No gun, no knife. You can barely stand upright. What are you going to do? Save him with words." Ellie took 1 step closer. Warren raised the knife in warning, but she didn't stop. "I'm a nurse," Ellie said, her gaze locked on Warren. "I've seen enough people die to know one thing. People don't die because they don't have guns. They die because they run out of hope." She glanced at Miles, the boy staring at her with eyes full of tears and full of hope. Then she looked back at Warren. "And I'm not going to let this child lose hope." "Even if you kill me right now, Miss Ellie," Miles cried, his voice breaking with emotion and relief. "Miss Ellie, you came. Stay calm, Miles," Ellie said, her voice gentle, never taking her eyes off Warren. "I told him I'd stay, and I intend to be the last thing he sees before he's safe." Warren looked at her, then at Miles, then back at her. His face shifted from shock to rage, from rage to something feral. "Enough," he roared, shoved Miles down to the ground, and came at Ellie with the knife raised high. "You want to die with him? You want to be a hero? Fine, I'll give you what you want." Ellie stood her ground, not running, not backing away. She knew she couldn't outrun him. She knew she couldn't fight him. There was only one thing she could do. By time, every second she stretched was a second the rescue team got closer. Every second Miles stayed alive was a second of hope. And she would fight for every one of those seconds. Even if it was the last second of her life, Warren advanced on Ellie, the knife raised high, his eyes bloodshot with madness. She stepped back once, twice, knowing there was nowhere left to run. Behind her was the drop. In front of her was a murderer with a knife in his hand, and she had nothing to defend herself with. This was probably the end for her, but at least she'd tried. At least she'd kept her promise to the very last moment. Then that voice cut through the air like a blade, cold and certain. "Warren!" Everything froze. Warren stopped mid-step and snapped his head toward the treeane. Ellie looked too, and there he was, the man whose cold gaze could freeze a room. Jace Sterling stepped from the shadows of the canopy, his presence alone commanding the silence of the forest. There was no emotion on his face, only absolute certainty, the certainty of someone who'd seen hell and no longer feared anything at all. Behind him stood Conrad and 15 other men, guns in their hands, lined shoulder to shoulder like a wall of steel. Ellie understood at once. This was Jace Sterling, Miles's father, the boss of the underworld empire, the man Warren had hated for 12 years. "Drop the knife," Jace said, not loud, but carrying through the stillness of the morning. "Let my son go." Warren stared for a second, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Then he laughed, a mad laugh, bitter and drenched in hate. "You finally came," Warren screamed, spinning to grab Miles from the ground, yanking the boy upright and pressing the knife to his throat. "The great hero Jace Sterling here to save his precious son. How long did it take you to find me? 3 days. Well, I could have killed him at any moment." "Warren, drop the knife," Jay said again, his voice still calm, as if they were talking about the weather. "No." Warren shouted, clamping harder around Miles, the blade pressing so close a small bead of blood welled up. 12 years, Jace. 12 years you didn't speak to me. Not one call, not one message.